Hey, all y'all out there. This podcast from a poverty scholar today is dedicated to my mama and to all the other poor people, poor children specifically, caught in the child separation services, juvenile dependency, KKK courts, and the foster never care about you system. And to the poor children who just got run off a cliff by these two middle-class white women, possibly upper middle-class white women, who every time there seemed to be any kind of questioning of their obvious bizarre behavior and abuse, all they had to do was pick up all their things with their obvious money, trust fund, whatever they were rolling with, and completely move out of state. Yeah, today's podcast from a poverty scholar is dedicated to all our babies, our poor babies. And I'm sure that most of the people listening have heard of that horrible story, and I wrote about it as well, as this podcast specifically triggered me because I'm the daughter of a mama who barely could make it, who barely even seemed able to be my mama, much less stay alive. But she's not unique. She's like so many of us, traumatized, colonized, destroyed people from a racist classist system who, if they're an unprotected child, they're obviously one of the most at-risk humans in the world, as far as I'm concerned. And in my mama's case, that's what she was. She was born to a Roma Irish domestic violence victimized teen parent who had literally run out on the man who offered her paper privilege, citizenship, in exchange for quote-unquote marriage and sex, had 3 children by her, and then basically tried to kill her every day. Goes on the run in Philly back in the 50s and meets my Afro-Boricua abuelito, Roberto, and had my mama. But being the good Catholic girl that she was struck with shame. And when she reached out for help, she didn't get help from the anti-social work industry in the state. Instead, she got criminalized and encouraged to give my mama up, which she did. And so my mom was put in a series of foster homes that literally, as she described them, tortured her. She often felt that she should be part of the torture group in the United Nations. People have been tortured all over the world because the torture she experienced really could have and should have killed her. And she kept on keeping on, like a lot of us poor folks. You know, they talk about quote-unquote resilience. I think maybe what it is just we put on our shoes and socks and our clothes and we get up another day because maybe we aren't able to end our life. As my mama used to say, I just don't have the courage. So, she got with my white dad and had me, and the rest is her story. But going back to the story of these beautiful children, apparently I got with these 2 women. We don't know why exactly. I will say that oftentimes people enter the foster care system for all kinds of reasons, not many of which are not good, but several of which, like the woman that abused and tortured my mama, one of the women that abused and tortured my mama, because they wanted this idea, this concept of the perfect family. And when real life, in other words, caring for my broken mixed race mama wasn't like her image of it, then all she wanted to do was dispose of my mom, wanted to get rid of her, like she was a piece of trash or a dress she didn't like to wear anymore. And so she had my mama fighting with dogs for food and using her as a sex slave and traipsing her out for parties and all these other things that no human, much less child, should ever have to go through. According to the stories about these children who got adopted, there were accounts of abuse. There was literally an open CPS case in one of the places that they lived, and instead of dealing with it, basically, they, again, as I said in the beginning of the podcast, they just picked everything up and moved out of state, and went further and further into isolation, where they could perpetrate more bizarre, obviously some kind of insanity that they were dealing with on these poor innocent children. And in the end, got in their SUV with 3 of the children and drove off a cliff in what looks like a suicide, because there was no skid marks, so there was no reason to assume that it was an accident. Meanwhile, 3 of the children are missing, one of whom was the now famous or infamous picture of the African descendant child hugging the nice white police officer, which no one really understood where that came from. So obviously there was some bizarre internalized and externalized racism of these white women, and a great deal of insanity. Now, how does race and class interact with the racist classes eugenicist system? Well, first of all, the roots of the foster care adoption CPS courts in the U.S. is in 525 years of missionary lies, colonial theft of land, spirit, traditions, and women's bodies. And finally, it's rooted in the post-colonial concept of eugenics, pure race science, which actually the Nazis got from the U.S. Basically, the idea is that if you're a poor family, they use this concept of it's the best interests of the child to remove children from their homes of origin. Now, that happens in many nuanced ways. It's not one thing. But the decisions to remove children from their homes are almost always rooted in class privilege, aka poverty. If the birth parent or the parents are seen as unstable, air quotes, which is code for many things, all poverty related, i.e. homelessness, or not having stable housing, not being quote-unquote gainfully employed, not being educated or holding a higher education, or more subtle things like acting ghetto or even showing anger or frustration in front of the anti-social workers, you can risk losing your child. And if the system is in your life, in other words, for these little welfare crumbs, or, you can never buy enough food stamps, EBT cards, or now the food boxes, you're immediately being surveilled by the system. And instead, again, of supporting you, what they'll do is profile you. The sick, sad classist paradox in these multiple systems, that they will actually grant foster parents and state-licensed group homes up to $5,000 to raise your child. And yet you, the parent, the poor parent, is given next to nothing or nothing but grief if you admit your poverty and struggle to the system. And again, this notion of best interests of the child comes from the missionary colonizer long-held belief that mere access to wealth deems you a better parent than someone who is poor. It is why they have been forcing sterilization on indigenous and poor women who have children for hundreds of years, conflating with race as well when it comes to the evil or colonial beliefs about white supremacy mixed with class supremacy. My mama's mama was encouraged by multiple social service agencies to give up parental rights. She was never offered support for raising her own child. Instead, there was a financial incentive to take children from their homes and parents of origin, and my grandmother's poor Catholic, guilt-stricken, DV victimized and confused mind was criminalized and shamed for being undeserving, with titles like, "You had that child out of wedlock," and "How did you end up with that bastard child?" in referring to my mama, her daughter, not to mention the shame of a mixed-race child. But lest you think that was the, quote, old days, today, Child Separation Services, aka CPS, APS, and beyond, receives up to $12,500 and some in more states to remove children from their parents. And this is something my Mama D and me and other poor parents researched, that's Poor People-Led Research, in 1999 and published in the Court Watch Project, something my Mama D did so much innovative work on. But the real place that white supremacy plays in, and this is specific beyond even class supremacy, is the way that these white women with class privilege, in the case this lesbian couple, were even granted the ability to adopt these children without being subjected to a psychiatric evaluation. Unlike us poor folks who are systematically given psych evals when our children are taken away from us, even if we don't show psychiatric manifestations. And these women were obviously abusing these poor children, these black children, these children of color. Similar to one of my mama's most evil parents, foster parents, who was a rich white woman who systematically raped and physically abused my mama for over 5 years of her life. They were never caught for it. These women seemed to go unfazed and unwatched when they perpetrated abuse on these adopted children. And it's kind of typical to allow wealthy white people to go unchecked in their violence and insanity because they weren't reliant on the state for support. Think police, right? Who gets profiled? Who gets shot? Same system, same knock. That said, I don't have an answer, as there are many mamas who, like my mama used to say, don't have the mama gene. So let's not be utopic and rush to the answer being all children should stay with their birth parents. But what I do say is we could cut at least 50% of these racist classes adoptions and CPS removals if we were changing the way the system supported poor parents to raise their own children. This is some of the research all of us powerful welfare queens, that's small w capital Q at Poor Magazine, have been doing for years, and many other poor and black-led movements across Americland who have been proposing and fighting these abusive child removal systems for years. In San Francisco in the 1990s, they used to have a model demonstration program for poor black families that actually fostered the whole family system. In other words, lived with them with a foster grandparent, encouraging and enlisting the strength of African indigenous deep structures of kinship to support the whole family into healing, rather than further the cult of separation that runs through the CPS and foster care systems all across Americland. Something my mama uncovered in the landmark Poor Magazine Volume 4 Mothers issue in her interview with Dr. Nobles. She tried to kill me multiple times. I'm not sure how I got out of there alive. My mama's voice trailed off one of the times she was retelling these horrible anecdotes of her life in these orphanages and foster homes. All I'm saying is, let's listen to these stories. Let's think a different way than the separation nation, and let's stop letting the anti-social work industry rooted in the settlement houses and the profiting off of poor people continue to rip apart our indigenous, poor, and people of color families. And let's actually care for parents in poverty and flipped the way that poor people are intentionally criminalized for the sole act of being alive, much less parents. That's this for the podcast for a poverty scholar. Much love to y'all. Much love to all the babies that keep fighting and keep trying to stay alive with so much pain in their eyes.